This is Take Flight with Mark Whittle.
I'm Mark Whittle, former city worker turned performance coach, and this is your place for inspiration and education on ways to optimise your performance. Thanks for choosing to take flight.
Okay, just given the sort of context, I suppose, like where I'd like to start is, what do I need to know about your upbringing? You mentioned New Zealand already, to understand who John Danaher is today.
In terms of upbringing, I had a strange situation. I was born in the United States. My father was a pilot for first the Royal Air Force in England during World War II, and then the Royal New Zealand Air Force after World War II. He married, and during the 1960s, New Zealand and Australia fought alongside the United States in the Vietnam War. So there were various military attaches from New Zealand and Australia who were stationed in Washington, D.C. during that time. So I was born in Washington, D.C., and shortly thereafter transported back to New Zealand to be raised. When my father was stationed back in New Zealand after his time was up, we went back to an Air Force base, and we moved around various Air Force bases until my father left the Air Force in the early 1970s, and we settled in a small town in the North Island of New Zealand called Whangaparoa. I'm told that Whangaparoa is actually quite a big town nowadays, but back then it was very small. And it was idyllic insofar as it was kind of like the stereotype of New Zealand: beautiful ocean, beautiful beaches, sunny, warm weather, and beautiful open pastures and wooded areas. We lived in a rather old house, but surrounded by beautiful nature, forest, beaches, etc. So even though we didn't have much in terms of material goods, we had something much greater, which was natural goods. And that was my childhood.
Interesting. So a lot of time in nature. It's interesting. I've got a 2.5-year-old daughter. We went to Disneyland Paris not long ago. And I used to love Disney, or I still do. But the thing that jumped out to me was the commercialism and the kind of the stimulus and the things that I guess I was exposed to as well, and how that affects our brains and our behavior and what we think is important, and how really I wanted to introduce more time in nature for her. But it's even Christmas, I noticed, like, present, rip it open. It's just the act of wanting to know what's inside it. Get to the next one. Do it.
I think the job of parenting is much more difficult now than it was even, when I was a child. When I was a young boy, our parents would literally just let us go. You wake up in the morning, we would run around and run out into the fields or down to the beach, and we'd come back at 10 o'clock at night. Yeah. And I couldn't even imagine parents doing that now. Like there were no concerns of child safety. There were no evil predatory types in the area, and you just ran around and you went to the beach, you fished, and you hunted, and life was very simple. Everything seems much more complicated now. You generally live much closer to other people. You have to be much more cognizant of who they are and what their intentions are. And you have the whole social media thing where children grow up far less naive than we did. For us, there were books. If you wanted to understand things, you read books. Nowadays, children don't really read books. They watch video, and they can engage with children from different countries, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very different world as far as being a parent. And I think it would be quite difficult to navigate through that world. And I'm sure you're finding that now.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's very challenging. It's made me grow a lot as an individual as well, though. I've had to ask myself a lot of questions and force myself to do things because I want to break patterns and have her not be like me, on the negative side at least. Do you have siblings then?
Yes, yeah. I was the youngest of 6 children.
Oh, wow.
And I had 3 sisters and 2 brothers.
What was it like being the youngest of 6?
I was a spoiled brat. Basically, I think it works in the following fashion. The oldest child has to be the first one to break the rules. So they get the most parental pushback. But with each succeeding child, the parents get more and more worn down until by the time I arrived, they just were like accepting of whatever I did. I think I was the spoiled one.
How do you think that's played out for you as you've become an adult?
I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I'm sure that a psychiatrist could definitely give me some interesting insights on that.
So I'm interested to know, I know you've studied philosophy, right? Was it Columbus?
Columbia University.
Sorry, Columbia in New York.
Yeah.
Was that in New York?
Yeah.
Sorry, Columbus is where I went.
No problem.
Interested to know, like, and your general thoughts, but also your experience as well. Like, what's your self-image of yourself? The reason I ask is you're highly regarded as the best coach in mixed martial arts, and whether you're the best athlete or the best person in your business or whatever that is, that can sometimes affect how you see yourself, positively and negatively. I just wonder how you've experienced being at the top of what it is that you do.
Mentally, I see myself as a curious idiot. I'm shockingly naive about many things in life and the world. And in many ways, I make very many foolish decisions, but I'm curious about things. So when I enter into a given domain, I'm usually quite naive. I often make some silly early mistakes, but because I'm curious, I keep researching and thinking and trying to improve over time. So that's how I always see myself, a curious idiot.
A curious idiot, I love that. So what is that? Is that the ability to be, humble?
No, it's just an accurate reflection. I don't consider myself to be particularly smart, but I do consider myself to be patient, and I'm curious. So once I get immersed in a topic, even after I usually start at a fairly low point, but because I'm persistent over time and I'm curious, I keep asking questions and trying to find answers to those questions. And if you do that long enough, you usually end up knowing quite a bit in that domain.
So could you say they're like starting at a low point, but you're at a high point? But is it because even at that level, growth means you're starting at a low point at that new level of elevation?
Well, in the case of Jiu-Jitsu, I started at about as low a point as you can start. I didn't even start Jiu-Jitsu until I was 28. I had no background in grappling, and I have a crippled body. I have a crippled left leg. So you couldn't hope for a less promising student than me. And but as I said, I was curious about the sport. It struck me as being something very interesting, and I persisted over time and started to ask what were the interesting questions about it, and tried to furnish answers over the last 30 years of my life.
When you started Jiu-Jitsu, could you have foreseen that this is where you would have ended up?
No. When I first started Jiu-Jitsu, I was a 28-year-old bouncer working in New York City. Really? And I did have a martial arts background. I started in New Zealand and did more of that in the United States, but it was not grappling. It was almost all striking. And when I came to the United States, I was very, very impressed by the effectiveness of judo and wrestling when I worked as a bouncer with some people I worked alongside who either had a wrestling background or a judo background. And their skill struck me as being extraordinarily effective. Now, this was quite shocking to me because growing up in the 1980s, martial arts was absolutely dominated by striking martial arts. Wrestling wasn't even considered a martial art. Wrestling didn't even exist in my country, in New Zealand. There is no wrestling team in New Zealand. There was a small amount of judo, but it was more or less dismissed because it has no striking. It's purely grappling. And the understanding was, in the 1980s, that the best fighter in the world was the best boxer in the world. So Mike Tyson wasn't called the best boxer of the 1980s, he was called the best fighter. And the assumption was if you got into a fight, it was fisticuffs that determined winner and loser. And it was shocking to me to come to the United States and see the people who never even threw punches or kicks, but they were incredibly effective in fighting. And this was really unexpected for me. Then there was the lesson furnished by early UFCs. Friends of mine would talk to me about this crazy event, the UFC, where different martial arts fought each other, and some small guy from Brazil it just tied everyone up and strangled everybody. And I remember being shocked by this. I heard there were boxers in it and kickboxers, and they didn't win. And it was very shocking to me. This culminated when a friend of mine, a dear friend who now lives in Australia, at Columbia University, told me he had just started this Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that I'd been hearing about while I was bouncing. And he was a relatively small fellow, and I was certainly bigger and stronger than him. And obviously I've been bouncing for many years. I'd been in many fights and been around people who fought a lot. He'd been training for 2 weeks, and he was just an academic and with no martial arts background. And he said, I've been doing this jiu-jitsu for 2 weeks, and it's really interesting. I think you should do it because you're working as a bouncer. And I was like, what are they going to teach me? That's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'd never even heard of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It makes no sense to me. Like, Jiu-Jitsu is a Japanese martial art. What do you mean, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? So he said, put me in a headlock. So we're in a Columbia University office during my office hours. I locked the door. He went down on the ground. I put him in a good headlock, a judo kezukatame. And he started twisting and moving and thrashing about, and I was doing my best to hold him down. And I was bigger than him, and he'd only been training 2 weeks. He was a white belt himself. But within a fairly short period of time, I was having a hard time holding this small man down, and much harder than I should have, given the size difference and the experience difference. After about 2 to 3 minutes, I realized, man, I'm getting tired holding this guy down, and he's not stopping. And at one point, he started to wiggle around and get close to my back, and I had to spring up to my knees and stand up and get away from him. And this to me was shocking, that someone who'd only trained for 2 weeks was giving a hard time to someone who had been bouncing for many years and had been in many altercations. And I was surprised by this. And I thought to myself, if this was a real fight, it could have been a problem. Imagine if he was my size and had been doing this longer. So prompted by that, I went down and did my first introduction class at the Jiu-Jitsu school. It was run by a man named Craig Kukak, who worked with the man who would ultimately be my teacher and sensei, Renzo Gracie. Now, Renzo was still trying to get his visa to come to the United States, so Craig Kukak was teaching classes on his behalf. And I remember going down for my first ever class, and I did well against all the white belts. But then I got matched with a blue belt. And there weren't many blue belts in those days. This is in the early, mid-1990s. And so I think there were only 4 blue belts in New York City and maybe 1 purple belt or something crazy like that. And I remember getting absolutely spanked by one of the blue belts. And I didn't know what was happening. I was getting arm locked and strangled. And I was thinking, my God, I'm getting killed by this guy who's not even as big as I am. I remember thinking at the end of class, man, I have to learn this. I can't stomach the idea that there's people out there smaller than me who can just toy with me like a child. If I'm going to get beaten, it's one thing, but to get just tossed around helplessly, this is unacceptable. So I swore to the moon and the stars that I would at least gain competence in jiu-jitsu. That was my only goal. I didn't want to be incompetent. And so I started studying, and within a very short time frame, I found that my work as a bouncer, as a security guard, got astronomically easier. It was much, much easier for me to control people. And I now had an option to control people in a relatively peaceful fashion. Previously, if someone caused a problem, there was a fight, you just had to hit them. There's no gentle way of hitting people. You got to hit them with everything you got. So now I had this ability to restrain people. I could pin them, I could hold them back, I could put them in standing holds against the wall and simply restrain them. And this proved to be very, very useful indeed. And as time went by and I gained skills, so too the job got easier and easier. Wow. But essentially, my only interest in jiu-jitsu when I began was in this kind of self-defense oriented aspect, where I used it as a practical way of making my job as a bouncer much easier. I was living a rather strange double life as a graduate student at Columbia University, teaching classes as a Ph.D. candidate. And that was my day job. And then at night I would work as a bouncer. So jiu-jitsu was a way to make bouncing much safer and much easier for me. Soon I started to develop a reputation for effectiveness in bouncing. I got many gigs around the city, and I was able to do quite well in that domain. But all that changed when I was nearing the end of my Ph.D. and I was getting ready to defend a dissertation. And 3 of the senior members of the Renzo Gracie Academy that I was training in left at roughly the same time to open up their own gyms. And my teacher, Renzo Gracie, said, John, you're going to have to start teaching. The three teachers, the three guys, Rodrigo Gracie, Matt Serra, and Ricardo Almeida, who were important teaching figures to me when I was coming up from white belt, had left, and I had to fill their place. And I remember thinking, like, this is a big moment. Like, my ambition coming to America was to get a Ph.D. and become an academic. Now I'd gotten very close with my jiu-jitsu family, and I was torn. Which way do I go? Do I go the route of academia, or do I go the route of jiu-jitsu? In answer to your question, there was no sign whatsoever that jiu-jitsu would become a viable means of generating income, or even just having a stable life. Jiu-jitsu was seen as a kind of fringe sport within a fringe sport. Mixed martial arts was banned in the United States on TV. You couldn't watch it on TV at the time. Yeah. And it was described as like human cockfighting. It was illegal in many states. Had made it illegal. It was illegal in New York, for example. There was no sign whatsoever that mixed martial arts was going to ever become a mainstream sport, and jiu-jitsu was seen as part of mixed martial arts. So it seemed to be a very unpromising career path. But I must say that from the time that I began jiu-jitsu, I truly believed that it was a great product. Like, I felt with my own body how effective it was in fight situations as a bouncer. I had seen with my own eyes and felt with my own body the degree to which it could change your approach to fighting and see opportunities to peacefully overcome violence rather than crush violence with greater violence. And so in my heart, I believed that it was a truly great product. And there are many great products in history that people identified as great, but the public hadn't yet identified them as great. And I felt like that's how jiu-jitsu was. I knew it was great. A small number of people around me knew that it was great, basically the people training, but the public at large didn't. But the product was so good that it was only a matter of time until their viewpoint changed.
That's so fascinating. So, John, this podcast is called Take Flight, and the kind of essence of that is this leap of faith or decision to step into something. So you've gone from essentially the dream of being an academic and actually, carrying that out to a degree, studying Ph.D, and then wanting to pursue that, to finding this sport.
Yes, and then, it was this great unexpected diversion in my life. Like the safe path for me would have been to get a Ph.D. at Columbia University, get a teaching gig at a university somewhere in the United States, publish a certain number of papers per year until 15 years later I get a cushy job at Stanford or something like that. Yeah. That would have been the safe path. Certainly I could have done that. But I just felt that there were certain directions in academia in the 1990s that I didn't agree with, and that I didn't want to push my whole life in that direction. And then this fascinating alternative had appeared, unexpected. And the question was, do you go the safe route or do you take the risky route? And on the face of it, my decision was absolute stupidity. I had come to university. I was in a good university. I was in a great PhD program. All I had to do was defend the dissertation. It was 95% done. I had a great dissertation supervisor. It would have been so easy just to go through with it. And I didn't. And I took what most people thought was a lunatic decision, which is to go into this strange-looking martial art that was largely unknown outside of the martial arts world, which is a pretty small world at that time. And at a time when it was basically banned in the state that I was living in, or at least the sport it was most associated with, mixed martial arts, was banned. And relatively few people studied it. And there was a sense in which imagine, for example, if you had invented something truly amazing. Imagine the Wright brothers, okay? They had invented, a or they were among the first people to get into powered flight. There must have been a time before the news had disseminated where they knew they had something truly incredible on their hands, but the world didn't know about it yet. Mm. And they must have said, we literally have gold in our hands, but no one knows. And there must have been a short period of time where they were moving through the world, looking at the world in a different way, where they were like, we hold something of incredible value, but no one knows yet. On a much smaller scale, I felt that way about jiu-jitsu, that there was this incredible product out there that was worth its weight in gold, but very few people knew about it. And if they just knew, it could take off. Now, the question was, how would they know? And a series of events lined up to make it work. The first and most important was that the UFC was bought by the Fertitta brothers. And they made a tremendous effort and a highly successful effort to rehabilitate the image of mixed martial arts. Because, like it or not, jiu-jitsu's credibility rested on its ability to perform in the atmosphere of mixed martial arts. So when they took over the UFC, they did an incredible job of rehabilitating the overall image of the UFC. They brought in some rules, they made some changes, and most importantly, they got it airtime on TV. They got it back on TV.
This is Take Flights with Mark Whittle.
We interrupt this podcast for a public service announcement. I'm so excited and incredibly proud for the first time to announce Take Flight Coaching is launching its very first coaching program, Flight Club. We're going to take you from confusion to clarity, from overthinking to decision making, and from procrastination to action taking. My guarantee to you is that at the end of this program, you'll understand your purpose. You'll have a deep connection with your core values, which dictate your behaviors. You'll build a vision for the future of who you want to become, and you'll be undoubtedly ready to take flight. The program launches later this year. I'm taking applications today. So if you're interested and think this sounds like it's something that would help you in your life, then sign up today at takeflightworld.com or DM me at markwhittle_TF. You'll be one of the founding members of Flight Club, which is going to live on forever and have many other programs and impact many other lives, and it'll be a pleasure to have you on board. I look forward to speaking with you, and more important, look forward to witnessing and observing you take flight.
As mixed martial arts began to rise, jiu-jitsu began to rise. The two go together, and most people got introduced to jiu-jitsu through mixed martial arts. Now, that's very different from most martial arts. Most martial arts, people get introduced to it through Hollywood. They see it on entertainment, and then they go and do the martial art. You know, they see a Bruce Lee movie, they see a Steven Seagal movie, then they go and study the martial art. Jiu-jitsu was very different. It had almost no representation in Hollywood or entertainment. Its only real representation was in the real world of mixed martial arts, and that's where people came to it from. So as mixed martial arts took off in the early 2000s, so did jiu-jitsu. Then on a personal level, took on as a student an incredibly talented young athlete from Canada called George St-Pierre, who would come down. He was working as a garbage man at the time, and he would come down from Canada on weekends and train. And I remember seeing this young man saying, this guy's going to change the way mixed martial arts is practiced. Like he's got the potential to create a paradigm shift in the way people see mixed martial arts on almost every level. Like, first off, he had a very clean-cut image. He wasn't the wild-eyed, tattooed, freak-looking fighter who would just show up and pulverize people and in a bloodthirsty fashion. He was like a gentleman and a scholar. So he would have mainstream appeal in a wild world. He looked like a gentleman and a scholar in a world full of savages. And physically, he was the amalgam of the various skills that make up martial arts, mixed martial arts, to a greater degree than anyone else at that time. He was the perfect integration of striking, grappling, and he changed people's attitudes towards martial arts. Previous to him, the whole idea was to specialize in one thing and be adequate at the other areas, whereas he was never a true specialist in any one discipline in mixed martial arts, but he was very good at all of them. And so the key for him wasn't being the best in one area. Rather, it was the ability to integrate the various areas together better than his opponents. And this changed the way people saw mixed martial arts. And I thought, this young man is going to make a difference.
That's amazing.
So I started coaching him, and sure enough, he did exactly that.
Wow.
He became the first truly mainstream star in the sport. And as his star rose and shone, so too did jiu-jitsu's.
And yours?
No, that's not so important. It's more about if jiu-jitsu rises, then everyone involved in it rises. That's the most important thing.
It's amazing hearing the story firsthand. Like, thank you for sharing that. It's
No problem.
great. If there's so many things I want to dive into around there, I'm going to pick a couple of things out. Like you mentioned something, use an example of the Wright brothers and how they might have had this gold in their hand for a period of time when they knew something that the world didn't. Likewise with jiu-jitsu. This is similar to people's ideas in life, whether it's a business idea or it could be a podcast or it could be something that someone's dreamed of creating for themselves and they believe it's special, but the world hasn't seen it yet or hasn't bought into it. Like, how do you maintain belief in that? What was your experience with that with jiu-jitsu? Obviously, a lot of it was external. But how do you hold on to that belief?
For me, it was relatively easy because I'd felt it so many times working as a security guard, as a nightclub bouncer. And so, you'll often hear people say the words, jiu-jitsu saved my life. Well, in my case, it actually did. Like, there were 3 occasions where jiu-jitsu did save my life. So I had tremendous faith in it. I'd also had many dear friends who I trained with, including my teacher, Gracie, who achieved remarkable things in the world of professional fighting. And their skill in jiu-jitsu was the only thing which made them successful in this regard. And so I had a fairly cast iron faith. It was based on just simple observation of both my own situation and those of my close friends, where I had seen people who otherwise were unimpressive in terms of their athleticism or their overall potential for fighting, nonetheless do very well just because they possess this skill. And so I came to see that if someone who, like me, had a very unpromising start in jiu-jitsu, started very late, started with a crippled body and no background in the sport, if they gained knowledge and skill, they could transform themselves. And I'd seen so many transformations that for me, I had cast iron confidence in its ability.
So it was the evidence.
The only question, I had the evidence. The only question is, will other people see it the same way? And as mixed martial arts rose and shone, and as stars started to emerge like George St-Pierre, jiu-jitsu started to rise.
Amazing. Interesting, because the whole UFC thing, which was a big tipping point, that's external, that's outside of your control. But you were obviously doing things that were working or elevating your status or skill level, talent, call it whatever, because GSP found you as a coach. So how did that come about? Why did he come and train with you?
I had established a solid reputation as a coach in New York City, and the jiu-jitsu community is relatively small in the northeast of the United States. There's a much bigger jiu-jitsu community at that time in Southern California. Northeast of the United States, it was New York City was pretty much the only place where there was a reputable school at that time. And George lived in Montreal, and various people had come down from Canada, trained in New York, and they had seen me teach, and word of mouth had gone back. So it was word of mouth. And then George took what was a huge risk for him. That's an 8-hour bus ride for a garbage man to come down. He spoke no English at the time. His first class he came in, I'll never forget it. I was at the front desk getting ready to teach a beginner's class, and George St-Pierre came in, spoke no English, just looked at me, and didn't know how to count in English, and he didn't know how much we charged for a class. So he just put all his American money on the table and he'd saved up all his money, and he just put all his American money on the table and then looked at me like, is this enough? And then I remember putting the money back. I felt so bad. I just pushed the money back at him and said, don't worry, just come in and do the class. And that's how it started. But yeah, it was a huge risk for him.
Wow. Yeah, another example of a leap of faith.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated to know then, so where did the credibility come from? You said you built some credibility within jiu-jitsu.
Really, it comes from the fact that there's 2 ways you can do it. You can either demonstrate it, Now, for me, that was always an issue because I never competed. I was never a competitive student. For my teacher, Henzo, he demonstrated competence by winning competitions. So for me, it was always like, I never actually competed. So there was always this credibility question. How do you know he's any good? Never competed. I would spar with people in class every single day. I used to spar 7 days a week, and every class I would spar in the classes. And there's a clear sense where when you spar with someone, you can immediately judge their skill level. Like there's no faking when you're sparring, and you can't just say, "Oh, I'm good," and then you got to go out there and actually perform. So sparring is the clearest sense or the clearest means by which you can demonstrate skill level. So this was my method. I didn't compete in a competition circuit, but I sparred every day in the gym, and so this was an easy way to demonstrate proficiency.
Great, yeah, amazing. And that's kind of like that respect that you get. Interested as well because you're like call like your training lineage or the people that you were exposed to. You've mentioned some already, is incredible. Was that luck? Was that intentional?
That's a great question. On the face of it, I would say that I've been extraordinarily fortunate in the students who have come to me. One thing that's odd about me is that I've never been in a position to recruit students. I've never actually owned my own school. I've always taught out of other people's schools. Most people, they have their own school and they pull people in and they often form a competition team by recruiting. They say, they meet a guy at a competition, "Hey, you're talented, come and train at my school. I'll give you free membership," or what have you. I just teach whoever's on the mat. So I've never actively recruited. People come to me. George came from Montreal. A lot of my well-known students came from New Jersey and Long Island. Often it'll be word of mouth. They'll just hear, "Oh, there's a guy teaching there," and they'll come in and do a class and enjoy the class and see that there's something which brings them in. I've never actively sought out students, but I have been incredibly fortunate insofar as I lived in New York City. New York is like a mecca for talented people. It's an easy place to travel to. It has great infrastructure for travel. So people would often come in. The school that I taught out of had an excellent reputation, and I had talented students. As these students gained proficiency, word of mouth got out that, hey, there was this school in New York where the standard is very high and the training is very good. And talent attracts talent, so to speak. And so I never had a problem having talented people in the room. The only question was, of course, who would be the most talented? In a room full of talented people, there's always going to be the cream of the crop. And those would, of course, invariably be the hardest working and the best problem solvers. And over time, I've had many extraordinarily talented students come through the doors.
What were some of the biggest things some of your mentors taught you that you've held on to throughout your career?
I think the people who had the most effect on me would be my philosophy professors.
Wow.
Because they hammered home the idea that the most important thing in a world where all the answers are usually a little unclear and ambiguous and controversial, the most important thing is the questions that you ask. And when it comes time to assess the mental acuity of a jiu-jitsu student, the first thing I do is I assess how good are their questions. If they're asking the right questions, then I see talent. If the questions they ask are unimportant or unclear or poorly structured, then you got a lot of work to do to make them better. Philosophy taught me that answers are important, but for long-term progress, the most important thing are the questions you ask, because that will always determine the kind of research program that you finally generate. And that research program is ultimately what's going to generate answers. So if you start off with the right questions, your task will be a lot, not only much more successful, but in a sense much deeper. And so I've always been eternally grateful to my study of philosophy. I made many foolish decisions in my life, but the one wise decision I made was to study philosophy. And it's mostly for that reason, that it pushes you to ask the right questions, to divide difficult problems up into areas, to make precise distinctions, and to ask deep and profound questions about whatever you're studying.
Yeah, that's an incredible answer. I'm a deep thinker myself. I ask a lot of questions. I'm a coach that works with people one-to-one, so it's all mostly question-driven.
Interesting.
What are the answers that you're looking for yourself at the moment?
Not really. My primary thing is the growth of my students. So the eternal question I'm always asking is, am I providing a framework where they can maximize learning in the minimum time? So it's always, what is the maximum progress in minimum time? That's the single biggest question that dominates my life.
Interesting. What is the maximum growth in the minimum time? Have you got answers for that?
I have answers that I currently accept, but are always open to revision in the future.
Yeah.
You never want to become too dogmatic. You don't want to say this is the right way to do things. I'd say this is working well, but there's always a question: could you be doing better? And if you ever stop asking that question, that's usually when you fall behind.
What is it that's driven you to want to help other people?
Part of it is practical. I'm a cripple, so early on in my life, I thought to myself, well, it's going to be difficult for me to become the best in a physical domain, but one thing I can do is help other people who aren't cripples to get to their goals. And so part of it was practical. But once I started that path, I became eternally grateful for the decision that I'd made, because it dawned on me that the greatest moments of happiness in my life have almost all come from seeing someone else realize their goals rather than myself realize my goals. And that there's a much deeper sense of happiness and joy associated with a group of people making a goal together than you as an individual making a goal for yourself.
Do you think that's individual, or do you think that's a general rule that we can all live by?
I think it's pretty general. I think most people are, obviously there's some self-interested people out there, but I think that in general, people have a need for association with others, and you can't live your life alone. You'll just be miserable. And there's a real joy, I think, in the overwhelming majority of people in being part of a shared project where you feel like you're striving towards something bigger than just yourself, and that there's a certain emptiness and loneliness and shallowness in a life lived only for your own self-interest. And humans, the majority of humans, I believe, will ultimately reject that in favor of a communal project where people work together and go through shared suffering, shared grief, shared sorrow, and shared triumph towards a common goal.
I recently heard someone say that the human experience isn't about the bricks, which is representative of the individual. It's about the glue or the cement that sticks it together. That
Interesting.
I saw something you shared the other day which really spoke to me, actually. You spoke about it, of course, from the perspective of jiu-jitsu. You talked about the ability to defend yourself against an opponent is directly related to your ability to connect with them. What did you mean by that?
It's a straightforward physical thing. In jiu-jitsu, the quality of your technique, at least in terms of offense, is almost always directly proportional to your ability to form a solid connection to your opponent's body. Lack of connection. Yeah, physical connection. Lack of connection almost always means inferior technique. There has to be a certain tightness in your technique in order for it to be effective. And lacking that, you'll always have weak and ineffective technique.
What do you think about the same rule applying to some sort of don't know, you want to call it a spiritual connection or an energetic connection?
No. I'm very much a physicalist when it comes to combat technique. It's just mechanics.
Okay, so it wouldn't be some sort of, I'll call it like an understanding of them as a person. Yeah.
Now you're getting into tactics and strategy. There it can have some relevance. But when I talked about that example, I was taking purely in terms of mechanics.
Okay.
For me, the interesting question, the most interesting questions are how are you going to mechanically defeat an opponent?
What's important about control, obviously from a fighting aspect, but translating that to life as well?
Yeah, it gives you a tremendous number of options. In the case of combat, when you control someone, you can vary the degree of intensity of your response to them. One of the beauties of jiu-jitsu that we pointed out earlier was the idea that it gives you a huge range in terms of how violent your response to their attack is. It can be anything from very, very mild, from simple controls and pins and just restraints, all the way through to a stranglehold taken to its conclusion, which is death. So it gives you the full spectrum of response. And that gives you a tremendous sense of, there's the physical control, and there's also the almost like moral control of the situation, where you can go all the way from a rather restrained and passive path to victory to an incredibly violent one. And so there's this sort of, there's a sense in which you control not only the outcome of the fight, but also the degree of severity of response. So almost every aspect of the fight gets controlled.
It's really interesting because so much of that does translate to life and what we can and can't control. And I suppose for myself, am I a white belt if I've done 2 sessions? Nearly? No.
You're a no belt.
I'm a no belt. Okay.
You have to join up a school, and,
Okay.
And then you would get your white belt. Yeah.
Okay. Even better example then. So I'm a no belt. And when I'm practicing in these 2 sessions that I've been in, I don't feel in any control.
Yeah.
Really.
I had the same feeling in my first class.
Yeah. How do we manage that?
You feel the opposite. You feel that you're on the wrong end of the stick of control. Like you are being controlled.
Yes, exactly.
And this is not a good feeling.
Yeah.
You know, it's an odd thing that a white belt has no sense of how to control another human being, but they all have an innate sense of when they are being controlled. You don't have to have any martial arts knowledge whatsoever to know this is not good. I am being controlled, and I am no longer in control of my own movement. This guy is. This is a scary feeling.
What's strange is I don't know anything that I'm doing, but I can, like you're saying, I can sense when I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
And that, I quite liked that.
Yeah.
Instinctively, I was moving my leg in not necessarily the right place, but a place that was at least trying to help me to get, like, pick up on something and get out of the way.
It's an odd thing that instincts can often get you in trouble in jiu-jitsu when you first begin, because many of our instincts are designed to create flight, and you often expose your back and make a bad situation considerably worse through instinct. And a big part of coaching a beginner is to corral certain instincts and make use of those, but expunge other instincts, which end up getting you in hot water.
Yeah.
So instinctive responses can be a blessing and a curse when you first start off.
Okay. So how do we manage or cope with that feeling of being completely out of control?
Training.
Okay.
Exposure.
Yeah. Repetition.
Yeah.
Interesting. Something Tim Kennedy said to me, which was fascinating. We rolled for 5-6 minutes tops, and he was able to say a lot about me. We didn't speak a load, but we rolled for 5-6 minutes, and he was able, you know, he reeled off a load of things. Some of them nice, some of them not so nice, but, you know, was able to say how I dealt under pressure, my stress response. He knew I didn't smoke, didn't drink. Like, he knew I was fit cardiovascularly and all these things. I thought it was fascinating.
You get a tremendous ability to read someone when you put them under pressure. Like, again, it goes back to this idea of connection. When you connect to a human being and you're grappling, you get to read every aspect of their body. You can feel their heart rate, their breathing. You can even see the dilation of their eyes and how much panic response there is in their eyes, their facial tension, things like this. So you get a degree of assessment of a human being, which is quite interesting and unique. Moreover, many of the responses when you're grappling cannot be faked. Like, if you and I engage in a conversation and we don't know who each other are, we've never met each other, both of us will put on a lot of fake ears. As human beings, we want to impress each other, so we say certain things, we act in certain ways, we put on a certain body language. And many of these will be designed to create an impression which may not be particularly accurate. We're trying to put forward an image, and the image may not accurately reflect the reality of who we are. But in grappling, you can't do that. You're under stress and you're fighting for survival. And so you can't fake your heart rate. You can't fake your breathing. You can't fake stress levels. And an experienced grappler can feel all of those immediately. In this sense, you get a very honest appraisal when you grapple. There's no faking it, as there is in ordinary life. So you as Tim pointed out, you get to read people very quickly and very accurately in a grappling scenario, much more so than in daily life.
What a fantastic observation. That's the feeling I had. You're forced to be yourself.
Yes.
You don't have a choice to be anybody else. You're you in that moment and how you can cope with the situation.
Yeah. For good, better or for worse. Yeah.
And that's another interesting point is I talk about this in one of my talks that I give where, if it is, I ask people to imagine they're meeting someone that they might not know or they might know a little bit, or it's a friend or of a friend, because that's the example you're talking about where you're more likely to put that act on. And you ask, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
Meanwhile, you're suicidal.
yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
know? And you have to ask maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 times until someone would open up and be honest. It's a strange society that we experience.
Yeah. We're social creatures, and any social creature is intently focused on hierarchy. Where do you stand in a hierarchy of social creatures? And we always try our best to bump ourselves up the hierarchy. It's human nature. You've been doing this since you were a child, and you're not going to drop it immediately. We spend the majority of our lives trying to cultivate a personal image and living up to it. And in many ways, it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just who we are. But it does tend to create situations where you can manipulate your body language to advantage and falsely portray yourself. In the case of some people who want to use this to advantage. But in jiu-jitsu, it's very, very difficult. Yeah. It's very, very difficult to fake things in jiu-jitsu. Like, you can't fake your skill level in jiu-jitsu. You either can or you can't. You can't just pretend to be good at jiu-jitsu. As I said, there's certain parts of your body you can't fake, like your body temperature, your heart rate. These are not up to you, and your conscious mind doesn't determine these. And so jiu-jitsu does tend to give a very accurate reading of people.
I also like that, when you are grappling with somebody or sparring, whatever you're doing, like, you're on your own,
For sure.
Yeah. I'd love to know, selfishly, what makes a great coach in your mind. What makes a great coach?
For me, it's always going to come down to one thing. Are you making measurable differences in the performance of your students towards their goals? And if the answer to that is no, or I'm not sure, then you're wasting their time and money. Your students come to you with a set of goals. In my case, it's usually winning some kind of championship. And I should be able to demonstrate an ability to facilitate their passage towards those goals, to either make them get there quicker and with less cost to their body and on the path there. So for me, that's always how I judge myself. Am I doing a good job of this or not? And when it comes to saying, okay, well, what are the attributes that a coach has to have in order to actually succeed in this quest? Well, there's a bunch of things involved there. For me, the single most important thing is the building of a general culture which facilitates that passage to victory, superstardom, or championship belts, or what have you. Here's an odd thing about this world of ours. If you look at any given sport, or even human endeavor in general, you will see uneven development and uneven results on a global scale. Let's look at a sport like sprinting, okay, Olympic sprinting. If you look at the number of gold medal winners in Olympic sprinting over the last quarter of a century, you will see that a massive, disproportionate number of these successful people come from a very small surface area of the globe, the southern panhandle of the United States and the Caribbean. Now, that's a tiny percentage of the world's population, and they've done extraordinarily well. You will hear many people claim some kind of racial argument for this, that people from those areas have genetic elements which make them more successful. I would disagree with this. If you look at the case of Jamaica, Jamaica was actually quite unsuccessful with Olympic sprinting until relatively recently. And so it's not just genetic, it's also cultural. Then switch sports. Look at the case of Olympic wrestling. The vast majority of Olympic medals won in the last 25 years have come from the Caucasus regions, in Russia going down to northern Iran. That small corner of the globe has disproportionately dominated the sport of freestyle wrestling in the Olympic Games for the last 25 years. Look at the sport of rugby. My country, New Zealand, is a country of only 3 to 4 million people. It's a tiny island in the South Pacific. And yet they have disproportionately dominated the sport of rugby. Why? Why did a country thousands of miles from anywhere in a misbegotten corner of the globe just suddenly become an international powerhouse in rugby like nothing else the world has ever seen, despite having a very small population? And as you get and you see more and more sports like this, you get to see that there's this pattern where certain sports tend to be overrepresented in certain areas, and there's no relationship between the number of people doing it. Sometimes the numbers of people doing it are quite small. Look, New Zealand, there's a tiny population. And you've got to ask yourself, what's going on here? Why is it that sports development is so uneven in this respect? Why is it that Australia is so successful in swimming? Okay, well, why is their swimming program so strong? Australia is a small population, but they punch way above their weight in Olympic swimming. Why? You can't just say, oh, Australia is surrounded by water. Australia's a continent. Okay, 90% of it is not surrounded by water. And secondly, there's plenty of other places that are surrounded by water, like Fiji, who never produced a single swimmer in their entire life. It's not just about that. There's something deeper. And what you will always see it is culture. A culture is created around a given activity. Now, where it comes from, what starts it, that's up to a bunch of things that we often don't control. But once it's created, once a culture is embedded, it creates an infrastructure which creates champions. And so my job as a coach, I've got many jobs, but the most important one by far is to create a culture of excellence where students come in and have high standards for themselves and focus on skill acquisition as the single most important thing in their life. Okay, if you want to get to the top, the thing you might need more than anything else is skill. Okay, you can talk all the way about natural talent, this, natural talent, that. Skills are what make you stand out from the crowd. So my job is to create a culture where skill acquisition is everything and standards are very, very high. So that no one's happy with getting the skills of a blue belt. They want the skills of a world champion. The lowliest guy in the room has the dream in his mind of becoming the best guy in the world. Okay, my job is to foster a community of people where everyone in the room thinks that they're fighting either to become a world champion themselves or to be part of a cauldron that's so hot that it creates world champions in that room. That's the minimum. Okay, and if you can create a culture like that, you'll do something special, and you'll mimic what happens all around this world of ours. That success or failure in sports, and this extends outside of sports, it goes into everything else. You show me any industry in the world, technology industry, it's always uneven development. Okay, why does Silicon Valley have 90% of the tech industry in the world? Okay, if Silicon Valley was destroyed tomorrow, technological progress around the world would be severely impacted for the next 50 years. Okay, that's how concentrated it is. This world of ours is built around the idea of concentrated cultures that build excellence in certain domains, okay? And I took that model and put it into one gym. And my job as a coach is to create a culture. And once you create that culture, magic can happen. And the basis of that culture is to develop a community of people who are obsessed with skill acquisition, and to create a set of standards that they look up to, where nothing less than the best is good enough.
Incredible. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. So standards and skill acquisition. Skill acquisition is the growth, and standards is what you're holding yourself to.
So my job every single day I wake up is to ask myself, am I doing the best I can to get these guys the skills they need to win? And everything I do in my life is just an answer to that question.
Brilliant. John, that's amazing. Thank you. We ask the same 3 questions at the end of every episode, sort of more quick fire questions. So the first one is there anything you've come across recently or discovered that you're particularly excited about?
The things that I'm most excited about are things I've known for a long time.
Okay.
I won't say that these are things I've recently discovered. No. There are many things that I've recently discovered, but they tend to be smaller things. But for me, the big thing is always the idea that the most important thing I can do as a coach is to look for items in my sport which people undervalue, but which have high intrinsic value. That they are valuable, but people don't recognize them as such. And if you can get a good sense of what these things are, learn them, teach them, the people who learn under you will have a massive advantage over their competitors. There's 2 kinds of value out there. There's the actual value of a product, and there's its perceived value. And these 2 things are often very different. There are many things out there that are very valuable, but no one perceives them as such. I'm told that when America was first settled by Europeans, they discovered lobsters in Maine. They were in such a vast number that they were disregarded. They were seen as like cockroaches of the sea. And so they were known as poor people's food. Poor people ate lobster because it was just everywhere and it looked like insects. And yet here we are today where lobster is the most expensive thing in a restaurant. There's a sense in which back then something which was valuable was perceived as cheap. And there's many, many products like this. My job as a coach is to look at the sport of jiu-jitsu and identify movements, tactics, which have real value, could be a very, very valuable part of a coaching program, but are not perceived as such by most people in the sport. And if you can get one of those things, it's like finding a stock, which is very cheap. It's like finding Amazon stock in 1997. Very, very cheap, but one day it'll be very, very expensive.
That sounds like a fun game to play. The next one is, if you could only offer one habit, this could be to your students or this could be to anyone who's listening, that's going to benefit them in a positive way and improve their performance. What one habit would you choose?
For everything you do, ask one question. Is this really the best way of doing things? Because in the vast majority of cases, the reason you're doing things the way you are is because that's the way you were taught. It's not because you've proven to yourself or to others it's the best way of doing things. It's just the way they've always been done. And so if something's important, ask yourself, is this really the best way it could be done? And then you'll see some interesting things.
It's a great question to break the conditioning. Yeah, a great question. Okay, the last one of these is, if you take yourself back to a particularly challenging moment in your life, and you can share the story of that if you want to as well. Imagine there's 2 versions of yourself that has faced that challenge. What's the key trait between those 2 versions, one of which has allowed you to get to where you are in your life today, seen all the things you've had, experienced all the things you've experienced, had the success that you've had, versus the version of yourself who wouldn't have done those things, wouldn't have been able to do them?
Are you asking this in terms of if things had been different, would have been different outcomes?
I suppose.
As it stands, your question is a little vague and ambiguous.
Yeah. I suppose if the event remains the same, what's the trait or the reaction or the response from you that allowed you to go on and have the career that you've had versus a version of yourself who didn't make it?
Well, probably the most pivotal moment in my career would be the decision I had to make between going the safe route to academia versus the very risky route towards jiu-jitsu. And I've always been a believer in calculated risk. And I was taking a huge risk when I left academia. That would have been a very comfortable, predictable lifestyle. And I was trading that in for something which was anything but. Like, I had a crippled body and a sport where you're expected to be strong. I'd started very late, and the sport was a very obscure, even poorly looked upon sport at that time. So there was a huge risk. And I think if I'd been overly interested in safety, then nothing would have happened. I would have been a quiet professor at a small university in the Midwest for 20 years and then gone to a bigger university as I got older. So there's a sense in which if I had been more concerned with safety and probability, this jiu-jitsu career never would have happened. And that would have definitely shut a door on things. So I've always been grateful for the fact that I was able to take a risk, and that I had the ability to identify the potential worth of a product over its current worth. And that's what pulled me through and got me in the direction that I went.
And there's many people who are grateful you made that decision as well. Thank you so much.
No problem.
For lots of things. You've come here at 9 p.m. after a full day's training and coaching to sit with me and have a conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you for welcoming me so wonderfully into your space, into your class, my first ever class. I'm spoiled rotten to be.
I think it must have been a bit of a challenge. You came in your first, it was tough for me. I went into a class where everyone was just white belts and blue belts. You came into a class where everyone was the best players in the world.
Yeah.
So that must have been pretty intimidating. So,
well, I felt incredibly honoured, actually, privileged to be there, and I was scared for sure before I walked in the door, and then when it finished, it was just one of the best days I've had in such a long time. I'll remember it for forever, and it was a really special experience. So thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you.
And yeah, good luck with everything, John.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to meet you.
You have reached your destination.
Hey, it's Mark Whittle. Thanks so much for watching or listening. It's so great to have you a part of the Take Flight movement. Subscribe to the podcast on all platforms, video and audio, to be the first to see new episodes and new conversations with the greatest minds in the world. Follow me at markwhittle_TF on all social platforms, and visit takeflightworld.com to join our growing community of hustlers, performers, and go-getters. I can't wait to see you next time. Until then, stay positive, stay motivated, and of course, take flight.